With me, thank you. I was about to say, with me, I have Lasara on behalf of the North Carolina Bar Association, who helps staff our Administrative Law Council. I just want to make sure we're all set to go. Lasara, anything else you need from us before we get going?
Alrighty.
All right, thank you. Okay, well, let me welcome you again to our presentation today on rulemaking. This is our Rules of the Road seminar that the Administrative Law Council makes available every so often to both members and non-members of the Bar Association and attorneys and non-attorneys alike. Anyone with interest in rulemaking, we hope this is a helpful resource for you. And today we're going to be talking about the fiscal notes in particular. The topic is finding the way on fiscal notes. Just a quick plug for the administrative law section of the Bar Association. Its purpose is to serve the interests of lawyers who represent and practice before state and local regulatory boards and commissions, including the offices of administrative hearings and occupational licensing boards. It's the section's stated goal to lead in the improvement of administrative rulemaking and adjudication before OAH and boards and commissions. And so we hope that if you want more information on the administrative law section, you reach out to me or to Lasara, and we'd be glad to give you more information on how you can join if you're not already a member. So with that said, let me introduce you to our speakers today. We have with us Julie Ventolaro, who is an economic analyst with the Office of State Budget and Management, and Jim Haughey, who's an attorney and consultant with particular expertise on fiscal impact analyses and fiscal notes. We're delighted to have them both, a wealth of information for us, and thank them for their time in putting on the presentation today. Just a couple of housekeeping matters for everyone who's listening in. A reminder that this is not a program for which CLE credit is available. It will be recorded though, and a link will be sent out to registrants later on today if you want to keep this and review it later on at your convenience. If you have any questions for the presenters or the administrative law section, please put them into the chat. At the end of the presentation, we'll save some time for questions and answers so that we're able to answer those if we can. If we can't answer any particular questions you might have, either online here or offline later, if you want to email us separately, we'll do our best to get back to you on an individual basis. So don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of help. I will let you put a date on your calendar for February 6th. That will be the next date that we're offering another Rules of the Road presentation at the 12 o'clock hour. The anticipated topic for that session will be rules that every agency is required to have, even if they don't otherwise have rulemaking authority. So hold that date if you're interested. Also, if you have any ideas for future Rules of the Road topics that are on your mind and you think would be helpful for our membership to hear more about, you're always welcome to email Lasara or me. I'll put my contact information into the chat so you've got that handy. Just let us know you've got a Rules of the Road idea and we'd be glad to see what we can do with it. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Julie and Jim, and thanks again for your time.
All right, I'll get started. I'm going to share my screen. Does that look okay? Okay. Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. And again, my name is Julie Ventolaro. I'm an analyst with the Office of State Budget and Management. And first, I just wanted to apologize. I've been sick this week, so I sound a little hoarse. And if you weren't expecting to hear a presentation from someone that sounds like a frog, I apologize. But I may also just take a sip of tea every now and then. So I apologize for the interruptions, but thank you for bearing with me. So I am the primary point of contact for agencies who are preparing regulatory impact analysis. We also routinely call these fiscal notes. So hopefully today's presentation will provide you with a practical introduction to fiscal notes and the analysis process. I'm hoping you'll leave feeling a little bit better equipped to tackle the fiscal note process in the future and remove any hesitation that you might have. about your ability to do a successful fiscal note. All right, and the agenda today, and I believe Lasara was going to share some poll questions with you as you were signing on. Let's see. Lasara, did that process work? Okay. Oh, are you sharing it right now?
Julie, I've just had a poll pop up on my screen, and I expect our other attendees have
I
as well.
see it. Okay. I gotcha. Okay. Well, if you all would take just a minute or so and answer these three questions about your familiarity with the process, I would really appreciate it and be very curious to see what the level of experience and involvement in fiscal notes are for our audience today. So just take a few seconds, and I think Lasara, you'll share the answers with all of us, right? Okay, thank you. The results are in, and it looks like in the question about experience with fiscal notes, how often have you been involved in preparing one or reviewing one in the past 2 years? More than half have said once or twice or never. And there's a fair amount of you that have had some experience. And I did recognize a lot of your names when I was logging on. So I think um, it's nice to see you all here. Let's see, the second question was about familiarity with rulemaking and the requirements under the APA. And little bit more of you are familiar, or very familiar with that. And the third question about working with OSBM, have you ever consulted with us during the rule development or fiscal note process? And 53% have not done so, but a fair amount of you have. So on this one, I would just encourage anyone that ever has a question about fiscal notes, if you need one or not, feel free to give me a call. So thank you for answering those questions. It'll help me as we're going through today's agenda. And here are just, on this slide, just a brief overview of what I plan to cover. And Jim is going to come on after me and kind of I think reinforce and add to what we've discussed here. So I'll touch on what is a fiscal note, what triggers a fiscal note, how do we determine what we call impacts, why do fiscal notes matter beyond just the APA requirement. I'll talk about what my role and OSBM's role is in the rulemaking process. And I'll leave you with a couple things about what's new in our fiscal note world and some tips for success and some additional resources you can access. So first, what do we even mean when we talk about a fiscal note? And throughout this, you'll hear me say fiscal note and regulatory impact analysis. I use them interchangeably. They mean the same thing. But when I say fiscal note, I'm not just talking about the document, the, the electronic paper that's required by the Administrative Procedure Act. It's more importantly, I'm talking about a tool that's used to identify, quantify, and communicate about the expected effects of a proposed rule change. At the end of the day, what we're really trying to get at with this analysis is, will North Carolina be better off as a result of the rules that we're proposing? To help figure that out, we look at the impacts of the rule and then quantify, and sometimes when we can, put dollar amounts on them. And this helps us weigh the benefits against the cost and understand the trade-offs for different groups. Overall, this helps us to see the bigger picture of whether we're getting a good return on our investment for North Carolinians. It can be helpful, I think, to think about, to understand what a fiscal note is by thinking about what the goals of the analysis are. First, it's a method for improving rule design at the front end of the rulemaking process. Going through this type of structured analysis can really help you make sure that the rules are addressing the underlying problem that you're trying to address, while also proactively identifying and correcting any unintended consequences or undue burdens. The second purpose is to inform, particularly your decision makers, which are often commissions or boards. A fiscal note should provide important details about how a proposed rule will actually be implemented and the expected outcomes. And it is should be considered, I think, a very important tool that you have, along with public comments and other types of inputs to inform your decision makers about whether they want to move forward with the rule as it's proposed. Finally, the document itself is a way of communicating about or to the regulated community about the rule, increasing transparency, and it can also address anticipated questions or comments that you expect to get through the rulemaking process. So who is subject? Who's required to prepare these fiscal notes? The APA defines who is subject, as well as to some extent who is exempt from fiscal note requirements. But in general, most state agencies, commissions, and licensing boards are potentially subject. Who is not subject? There are numerous exceptions to this general rule, and a lot of them are spelled out in the APA. But in addition to that, there is sometimes new legislation that can include specific carve-outs. There's also some circumstances like readoptions that are making changes to rules that reduce the burden on the regulated community. Those can sometimes be exempt from fiscal note requirements. And I'm just on this screen, there's just a very partial list of some, just to give you a taste of the complex web of who's subject and who's not. And I'm sharing, this is a cover page, it's a screenshot of the front page of a recently approved fiscal note. And I wanted to, for those of you who have never worked on a fiscal note, particularly, I wanted to just show you what a typical fiscal note can look like. Just make it a little bit more of a concrete rather than a conceptual idea. And I also wanted to take this opportunity to mention that there is no like accepted or required template or format for a fiscal note. So they all look a little bit different. However, there are certain elements that are required to be in a fiscal analysis, required by the APA. So we do tend to see some uniformity in how the regulatory impact analyses look. But that also being said, every rule is unique, so it's important to make sure that you tailor your document to accommodate the specifics of your rule changes and also accommodate the preferences of your rulemaking authority, who ultimately are the owners of this document. Shifting to when, not just the who needs to do a fiscal note, but when is a fiscal note required? This is one of the most common questions I get. And there's just a short list of triggers, but it's often the most difficult question to figure out. And the APA does describe when fiscal notes are required, and it does limit it to permanent rulemaking. So fiscal notes are not required by statute for temporary or emergency rules. It does the specific criteria the APA lists are a fiscal note is triggered when there's a state impact, a state government impact, a local government impact. And this includes revenues, expenditures, even staff time would be included as an impact, or a substantial economic impact, which is defined as an impact of $1 million over a 5-year period. So an analysis would be required when any of these thresholds are met. But I wanted to point out too that even when a fiscal note isn't technically required by the APA, it can still be a best practice to do one. It's a great, done well, a fiscal note can be a great way to communicate with stakeholders about what issues the state is trying to address with the rule change, and it increases transparency even when the impact is small. So I heard myself already use the word impact a bunch of times. What do I mean by that term? Impacts include both cost and benefits that come from the rule change. The key point being that these costs and benefits are not limited to just budgetary expenses or savings. The first thing that might come to mind is the time, money, or other resources that are needed to implement the rule, both by the state government, local government, or the regulated entity. But that, importantly, is only half of the equation. We need to remember that the goal of regulation is not about imposing costs, that we are not in the regulatory business to impose costs just for the sake of imposing costs. The state is always seeking to solve a problem, or such as protecting public health and safety, or avoiding negative outcomes, or improving efficiencies. So ask yourself at the beginning of rule development and fiscal note development, what are we trying to achieve with this rule? Why is it necessary to regulate it? There's things that we'll talk about a little bit later too about common impacts of rules that can include things like changes to risk of disease or injury, premature death, changes in healthcare expenditures, changes in the value of natural resources to the residents of North Carolina. There was a million examples, and the point is that the impacts go beyond just the budget. And a little bit about the scope of the analysis. It covers North Carolina. We don't have to go beyond the North Carolina borders. We don't account for impacts to entities in other states, even if there may be some. As I mentioned earlier, analyses should consider impacts for each of these groups that are on the screen to ensure we're capturing as full a picture as possible. Impacts are in our fiscal notes are captured from multiple perspectives. And to accomplish this, we have to draw from a variety of sources, including peer-reviewed scientific and economic literature, really important sources, administrative and program data from the agencies that helps us understand the expected impacts and the scope or frequency of impacts. Sometimes we have access to surveys, or agencies can survey regulated entities. And of course, professional experience comes or proves to be very useful from the agency's perspective. That professional experience can provide insights into things like implementation time, resource needs. But the big takeaway from this slide is that we need to use a mixture of data and expertise to try to build as complete a picture as possible of the potential impacts. And the APA does tell us that we need to quantify the cost and benefits to the extent possible. But in practice, we can't always put a dollar value on every impact of every rule. And that limitation can be especially apparent for environmental and health outcomes. There's always uncertainty about how regulation will actually change future conditions, even when the direction of change is clear. Many health or environmental benefits depend on many factors beyond the rule itself, and the research needed to link a specific rule to a specific outcome is often limited or missing. So this flow chart is to highlight the key information we would need in order to fully monetize the impacts of a rule. Typically, program staff and the regulated entities can describe how a behavior will likely change under the rule and what kinds of impacts are expected to follow. But we often lack really good estimates of how much conditions are going to change. For example, how much cleaner what the water will get or how much pollution will be reduced. We also may not know how these changes translate into things people value, such as better recreation, fishing opportunities, fewer illnesses, things like that. But the bottom line is there's a lot we need to understand in order to assign a dollar value to a rule's impact. But when we don't have enough data to do that, it's okay. We can still describe what's changing, quantify what we can. The goal is to paint as complete a picture as possible, even if not every part has a price tag that we can put on it. This this is my favorite slide for its content. There's only one thing I want to get across today. It's what's on this slide. And it's why I enjoy doing my job. It's why do fiscal notes matter? Besides the fact that they are required by the APA in a lot of cases, what value do they have? I want to try to shift the way some of us tend to think about fiscal notes. And I was guilty of this in the past too, before I was in this job. When done properly, a fiscal note or a regulatory impact analysis can help decision makers focus on what matters most, and often that's getting the biggest bang for the buck. A fiscal note can turn a very complex set of rules into something we can compare, question, and improve before adoption. They allow us to ground our decisions in data and evidence rather than assumptions. They show who's affected and help in a systematic way test whether a rule is really necessary or whether there might be lower cost ways to address a problem. They allow for an objective look at expected outcomes and make us stop and consider what success would actually look like given the rule. They also improve public transparency by making the analysis and the assumptions available for stakeholders to review and challenge. And I'd say that a strong fiscal note really highlights the uncertainties, allows us to refine the rule on the front end, and it promotes an efficient use of our very limited resources by highlighting which elements of the rules will drive costs and which generate the most benefits. So what I'm really trying to convey today and in this slide is that a fiscal note isn't a paperwork exercise, or it shouldn't be. It's a real opportunity to add value to the rulemaking process. This is a simplified schematic of the rulemaking process that I know a lot of you are very familiar with. And I wanted to show where OSBM generally fits in to this process and where the fiscal note tends to fit in the process. OSBM typically first becomes involved after the agency drafts the rule and prepares the initial impact or fiscal analysis. At that point, OSBM will review the draft and give feedback on methods, assumptions, clarity. The agency revises the rule or analysis in response. This is often highly iterative process. There's a lot of back and forth that happens before, and this all happens before public notice. And it could happen again. There could be some changes to the fiscal note required after public comment if substantial changes to the rule are made that such that it affects the conclusions or substantive matter of the fiscal note. A little bit more about our OSBM's role in this. First, it's to review the proposed rule changes and the analysis to ensure that the impacts are identified as fully and clearly as possible. We also certify that the rules and the analysis meet the requirements laid out in the APA. We provide technical guidance that is based on expertise in benefit cost analysis methods. And I am always here to help through that process since we recognize that most state agencies don't have economists or dedicated staff working on fiscal notes. So we work together through the analysis process. But at the end of the day, the fiscal note really is the agency's document. You are the subject matter experts, and I rely on you regarding details about the implementation of the rule, the basis for expected impacts, and things like that. Once the analysis is complete for certain rules, OSBM will also make sure that sufficient state funds are available to implement the rules. It's not required for every rule package, but it is for those that will require additional expenditure of state government funds. For those substantial impact rules, those ones over $1 million over 5 years, we also are required to certify that the agency adhered to certain rulemaking principles. To put it in more plain terms, we look at whether the rule was designed using the best available data and whether it tries to achieve the regulatory objective or goal while keeping costs as low as reasonably possible. Once the analysis is complete, and if those requirements are met, OSBM will approve the rules and the analysis, and they can move on to publication and public comment. Okay, Lasara, we're going to pause here for a knowledge check if you don't mind. I think Lasara was going to launch another couple of poll questions for you. So just take a second. Okay, let's see. So the first question was, which is not one of the purposes for conducting a regulatory impact analysis. And let's see, 97% Percent of you got it, got it right. The correct answer to what was not one of the purposes was to allow OSBM to influence the outcome of a rule change. These analyses are absolutely meant to inform decision makers about impacts, and it's a great tool for communicating about those impacts and for demonstrating whether a rule is reasonable and justified, but it is not to allow for OSBM to influence or predetermine the outcome of a rule. It is definitely not to give OSBM a veto. It is there, the analysis is there to support a transparent and evidence-based decisions. So good job answering that one. And similarly, Matt, the vast majority of you got the second one correct. True or false, an RIA can inform rule design. Of course, that one was true. And again, it should absolutely inform rule design, even when the impacts cannot be fully monetized. All right, let's talk about what's new in the world of fiscal notes. And one thing I wanted to point out was Session Law 2025-82, which many folks are calling the REINS Act for short, but I believe the title ended up being Limit Rules with Substantial Costs, or something to that effect. And a couple of the things it did was to change the old substantial economic impact threshold, which had been $1 million in 1 year, and it changed it to $1 million over a 5-year period. And this substantial economic impact threshold still includes costs plus benefits. It's just that it now made it a little bit more likely that certain rule changes would be considered substantial impact rules. And the other change I'm not going to really go into, it's on the screen, did add a new term called aggregate financial cost thresholds, which adds some new triggers that really kick in at the end of the rulemaking process when it comes to adoption and potential legislative ratification. And something else, many of you, I think on the webinar are rulemaking coordinators. And last week you should have gotten an email from me. This is an annual email that many of you probably dread getting, but it is to collect information for our report on rules with economic impact. This is a report that's required by the legislature. We're required to compile a list of rules that were adopted in the previous fiscal year that impacted local governments, and as well as rules that are anticipated to be adopted next fiscal year that will have state, local, or substantial impacts. Okay, and there has, in addition, excuse me, been a recent change to the OSBM website. In past years, we have kept an ongoing library of approved fiscal notes on our website. But due to federal web content accessibility standards, we're no longer posting the full contents of the RIAs on our website. And this ended January 1st, 2026. We'll still maintain that archive of past approved RIAs, but going forward, we're just going to have a list of fiscal notes that have been approved, and the list will just have the agency name, the rule citation, and the date the fiscal note was approved. And lastly, I know many of you out there are now getting into the throes of the readoption cycle, and just another plug to please reach out to me early, often, particularly if you anticipate making any changes to your rules so we can get a head start on the fiscal note piece of the rulemaking process. And I am not going to read this whole slide. This is really for you to review later, but I brainstormed what a lot of the common questions I get and the things that I most want to convey. A few of my favorite things I will mention, and as I said a minute ago, reach out to OSBM anytime. Always happy to talk about any rule, like any rules you're thinking about, any questions about fiscal note, any question is welcome. Schedule a touch point as soon as draft objectives are defined. You don't even need to have a rule draft ready. Really, contact me anytime. Also, I think number two here, document your reasons. If the agency decides you're not going to prepare a fiscal note, document your reasoning as to why you don't believe that's required. You also have the option to ask for OSBM's concurrence on that. And I know Jim's going to touch on that a little bit as well. Just having this documentation can save time later in the rulemaking process if you do get questions about why a fiscal note wasn't done, or why at least you could have still prepared one, but maybe you didn't submit it to OSBM. Whatever the circumstances, just document it. Please let me know as soon as you reach out to me if you have a rule or a fiscal note drafted. Let me know about any deadlines that you all are facing in advance. This helps me with my scheduling. Remember, this is number 10 I'm skipping down to. Remember that the benefits are also as important as the costs. The rule will generally be imposing some additional burden or cost, often on the regulated entity, but remember to think about why you're doing that. The benefits are just as important. And lastly, number 13, don't panic. Call me. That's it. That's just call me or email me. All right, and these are a few of the resources that I promised you. These will help reinforce what we talked about today or expand upon certain things. One of them I want to mention is the State Budget Manual, which is on the OSBM website. There's a whole chapter in that budget manual about fiscal analysis. It has some good information when you're really interested in getting into more detail about the process. Of course, there's the APA, general statutes, always good to refresh your memory about that before starting a fiscal note. And then on the OSBM website, as I mentioned before, there's the archive of approved fiscal notes and some additional information there. And also contact me. All right, that brings me to the end. And Jim and I don't think we coordinated really whether I should entertain questions now or wait until after you're done.
Well, Julie, I've
Up
got
to you.
one for you that may tie in nicely to your presentation, if I may, if that's okay. Um, Following up on the information you provided on, the acknowledgement that sometimes there's things that are really not subject to mathematical calculation. We just don't know how to put a number value on it. Do you have any tips on how we address that in the fiscal analysis? Should we just say we think this will be a benefit or a cost, but we just don't know how to calculate it? Or do we just leave it well enough alone and not mention it?
Yeah, I typically I would suggest that it be acknowledged that this is one of the uncertainties. This is an unknown, because I think spelling that out in the document can answer some questions that you anticipate getting too, like, well, why didn't you think about this from this perspective? And I think just being clear, like there isn't any reliable data on this yet, or whatever the case may be. I almost always would recommend being clear and upfront, like we just didn't have this. So we're focusing our analysis more qualitatively. But I think despite that, typically we can at least get a feel for or an idea of the magnitude and certainly the direction of the impact, even if we can't get a very precise estimate. At least we're providing context that can be useful. And I'll add to that too, when there is a big gap in the data, also would recommend some sort of sensitivity analysis or providing ranges and considering like, well, the various scenarios that could play out. Like what if the value of this benefit was X, here's what that impact would be. If it was on the other end and it's Y, here's what the impact would be. So providing at least, a bracketed range can be a really useful way to at least provide enough context for the analysis.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And one more quick question. Are those copies of the archived fiscal analyses available upon request if they're not on the website anymore?
Uh, yes, of course. Yes, always. The archive up till January 1st, 2026 is going to stay on the website. So it's about the past 4 or 5 years worth of approved RAs. Those will remain up. But going forward, this year and beyond, we can, I think they're all public information. So we can provide them, but also the APA does require agencies to post their fiscal notes on their websites anyway. So they should be available either way. But yes, we can always provide those upon request.
Thank you.
All right. Catherine, you mind if I go ahead and jump in here?
Please do. You have the floor, Jim.
All right. Let's see here. Um, all right. So again, my name is Jim Hawhey. My educational background is far from economics. It's in marine science and law, but I did spend a decade in state government, and part of my work was drafting some pretty tough fiscal notes. I've been in the private sector since 2022, doing some consulting with the Secretary of State as a current client. And this is just writing fiscal notes is the kind of thing that it's a little bit of a trial by fire. And I've been through a few fires at this point with Julie, which has been a really wonderful working relationship. So, but I would just want to give you kind of a sense of how I approach fiscal notes, maybe some practical tips, some big picture things to think about as you embark on your rulemaking journey, particularly as they pertain to the fiscal analysis. So we don't have a lot of time, but I'm just going to jump in. Julie touched on this, who writes these things. In a perfect world, you have PhD level economists, unlimited resources, decades of financial and economic data. Planet Earth, it's overworked agency staff, folks that have other jobs, other things to do. Like Julie said, you can ask OSBM to draft a fiscal note for you if you've exhausted all of your resources. OSBM can tell you no, and that has some minor impacts moving forward on approval of your fiscal note. You can also engage a consultant. I found this to be a niche business, and I'm available to discuss projects. I've also seen consultants engaged on specific aspects of a fiscal note, something like a long-term infrastructure analysis, things that require significant technical expertise. That would be for a really major fiscal note. want to talk about these thresholds that Julie talked about. We have substantial economic impacts, and I want you to think about that as a threshold for agency effort. How much work are you going to have to put in? Julie talked about the full fiscal note. She talked about the concurrence memo, basically asking OSBM to concur that you don't have substantial impacts. Julie's term for that, which she should have used, is a fiscal not, which I love. I think it just captures it perfectly. Or I say no fiscal note, but like Julie says, even a minimal amount of documentation is really is really advisable. When you look at aggregate financial costs, and this takes benefits out of the equation, just the costs, the thresholds that Julie showed you, they're thresholds for political feasibility. And I'd really encourage you, if you're going before a board, to think about what that looks like on the front end, because developing fiscal notes is a lot of work, especially for big rulemaking packages. And so, trying to ascertain what level of support you have for these for these rule packages before you go through what can be a pretty substantial effort to develop a fiscal note. I think that's just a really important mental exercise to try and do up front as much as you can. One landmine I see here is this issue of dealing with unquantified or estimated costs. That that new rule is written in a way that makes it seem like your estimate of cost is always a clean figure, and that voting threshold falls, in one bucket or another. And I think in reality, costs can be uncertain, just like benefits can be. And so, I think that's an issue that you're going to want to engage with strategically if you're doing a fiscal note, so you understand what the appropriate voting threshold is, and you represent your analysis appropriately going through the process. Let's talk about scoping a new rule package. So the question I would encourage everybody, whether you're staff, whether you're a policymaker, is the juice worth the squeeze on this rulemaking package? What are the net policy benefits that you're trying to achieve? Almost any rule is going to have both costs and benefits. You want to try and maximize benefits, minimize costs. That's just good policy. But don't forget about the administrative costs of rulemaking. This is something that's not captured in a fiscal note, the actual cost, the time and effort that it takes your staff to develop this information, and that can be substantial. Also think about sustainable implementation. If you get this rule into place next year, can you implement it in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And think about that for the long-term scoping of your fiscal analysis. Again, OSBM has to certify that you have funds available to implement these rules. And so you need to be prepared to make some sort of justification that that is the case, whether it's in the fiscal note or just in your communications with Julie. Ultimately, that's a certification that you're going to have to get. And then, of course, you always want to ask if you have to readopt soon. The threshold of whether or not a rulemaking package is worth it might be lowered if you're forced between a choice of trying to readopt an imperfect old rule as is versus refreshing it, refining it, and improving it with minimal impact. So if you have rule readoption on the horizon, that's probably the optimal time to move forward with the rule if possible. We're a little limited on time. I'm going to skip through the rule drafting tips, except just to know that if you're working on rule drafting, it is to your benefit, both as a regulator and to get through the RRC, to be using clear and unambiguous language. Don't try to be overly clever. Try to make it really clear to the regulated community what it is you're trying to achieve and what it is you're asking from them. If I could emphasize anything, it would be really focusing on that issue. And then I want to talk about maybe characterizing rule amendments. If you're developing a rule package, I'd encourage you to think about putting it in one of these buckets to start. Is this going to be kind of a minor rulemaking package, substantial economic impacts, or no substantial economic impact, so less than $1 million in impact? No state or local government impacts. That's kind of your road to easy street, if you would. I say typical here in the middle bucket. There's no typical fiscal note, not even close. I just couldn't think of a better word. But this is just going to be your routine fiscal note where you're following the requirements of the APA and developing a fiscal note that meets those requirements. If you have a substantial economic impact, but you don't have the aggregate financial cost of less than 20 million, I would kind of put it in this bucket. And then any rule amendment package with an aggregate financial cost of greater than 20 million, I'd encourage you to really think strategically about how you want to move forward because you've got multiple options. And I'll touch on all of those quickly. Minor rule amendments. These guys are happy they're out surfing because they don't have to write a fiscal note. Lucky them. And the question I would ask, is there any plausible argument that your rule amendments have a substantial economic impact? That could be an uninformed argument. That could be an argument from a stakeholder or a stakeholder group that's not supportive of your rulemaking efforts. If there is no plausible argument, some self-documentation is probably sufficient to meet the requirements of the rule. If there is any plausible argument, I really think it's in your best interest to draft a concurrence memo for OSBM. It's basically an abbreviated analysis justifying your decision to say that there's not a substantial economic impact. And the nice thing about doing this is you have control of that process. It's early in the rulemaking process. It hasn't been before the RRC. You can provide your justification. You can, check that against an experienced agency who can provide support for that conclusion. It's not a requirement in the early stages, but anybody can ask the RRC for a determination of whether your rules do have a substantive economic impact, and that determination goes to OSBM. And so if somebody asks on the back end, you're kind of on your heels, and you have kind of timing issues. And you have a little less control of the process. So it's something I'd really recommend the concurrence memo or the fiscal knot, just kind of getting OSBM's blessing early in the process. I'm going to blow through the typical or the routine rule amendments just in the interest of time. Julie really kind of covered a lot of this stuff, but understanding the baseline, I'm just going to emphasize this. Understanding the baseline is critical. And the baseline isn't just the existing rule versus your current rule. It's not just the black line, underlines, and strike throughs of your new rules. You need to understand the federal regulations, federal statutes. You need to understand the permitting stance. If there are any relevant local ordinances, you need to understand how people might behave in relation to your rules and how that behavior might change with a new set of rules. So all those things are fair game for the discussion of the baseline, because ultimately when you talk about a cost, where you talk about a benefit, it's a change. You have to measure that change from something, and that something is the baseline. I think when you start this process, you want to characterize your changes, again, just qualitatively. You just want to understand what it is that you're doing and how it's going to affect people. Do that first in a qualitative way, and then go back, see if you can make it better. Step 2 is where I think you really refine your analysis and try and put some data and try and put some numbers to the work that you're doing. And this gets to one of the questions that was, asked at the end of Julie's presentation. What data do you have? You want to use the data that you have, but you want to characterize uncertainty. If you don't have the data, you don't have the data, and you're going to be limited to a qualitative analysis. I think you want to discuss your impacts no matter what. But at the same time, if you can't make stuff up. You create more problems than you solve if you start trying to bootstrap on data that you really don't have. That's not very good. And then again, to Julie's point, iterate. The idea of this fiscal analysis, I agree with Julie. I see this as an opportunity. It is an opportunity to make your policy case. And doing a good fiscal note and refining your fiscal note in concert with your rules is an opportunity to make your rules better. So, before fiscal note publication, can you uncover new impacts? Can you improve the rule based on what you learned? There may be a kind of a go, no go. Have we learned something along the way in engaging with stakeholders or evaluating our data that makes us want to pause this process? It's a question you can always ask. Even after fiscal note publication, the public doesn't just comment on your rules, they comment on your fiscal note. So did your public comments reveal any impacts that you might have missed? Is that something you want to consider? There is a safe harbor for errors in your fiscal note as long as they're made in good faith, but your rules can still be objected to, so keep that in mind. Let's talk about major rule amendments. These are the ones with the aggregate the aggregate cost of over 20 million. And I think you have four options here. Number one, you can just proceed in accordance with the APA. This is just going through the rulemaking process, getting your rule package through your board, getting RRC concurrence, and then working with the General Assembly to ratify your bill on the back end. That is absolutely an option. But there are other options. Number one, you could work with the General Assembly to adopt costly rule proposals as laws. Okay, if the General Assembly has a completely different fiscal note requirement, and that's not really going to influence your agency much. So if you have to go to the General Assembly on the back end, you might consider going to them on the front end and seeing if they'll adopt your proposals as a law. That's one option for you. A third option is to work with the General Assembly to create a framework for your new rules. Again, if the General Assembly passes a law directing your agency to do something, the way that we've interpreted, at least the way I've interpreted this in past fiscal notes, is to say your agency has been directed to do something that's part of the baseline condition. Therefore, the cost associated with the thing that's been directed, that cost lies with the General Assembly and the law. It doesn't lie with the rule that you've developed. And so I wouldn't even call that a loophole. I would just say it's an opportunity to have the work with the General Assembly, have them carve out a lane for you in rulemaking, and that might make your rulemaking efforts easier. It might also change your aggregate costs, so your voting thresholds are different, right? So there are a lot of impacts that you can deal with there. Fourth option, good luck, but you could work with the NC, with the General Assembly to establish an exemption to your fiscal note. I'm not sure how successful that would be, but as Julie showed, there are exemptions for certain types of rules and for certain agencies in the APA. So I'm seeing that we're kind of coming up on time. I had some common myths and some other things, but I'm just going to leave you here with a final plug. If there are any agencies out there that have any interests in developing a rulemaking package, I would certainly be happy to entertain any inquiries. And from that perspective, we may have just a minute or two for questions, but I'm going to go ahead and close it out.
Thanks, Jim. That's really very helpful. I appreciate both your time on going through the materials today. We have just a couple of questions, so if I can hold you for maybe 5 more minutes, I'll put them to you. The first one is, what criteria must be met to exempt a rule readoption from the requirement to do a fiscal note? Or, put another way, what criteria triggers a fiscal note requirement in a rule readoption?
Yeah, I'll answer that one. And my first thought would be to always run this by your rulemaking coordinator first, because that's a conversation I think that needs to be had with them initially, and also in your rulemaking body potentially. But my understanding of that aspect of the APA is that if your rule changes are going to increase costs in any way to the regulated community, you would not be able to enjoy that exemption from having to do a fiscal note for a readoption. So I don't think many rules fall under that category or many readoptions, but I guess theoretically it's possible. There's also some I'm not really sure how that dovetails with there's an executive order we didn't touch on today, Executive Order 70 and 48, which were under Purdue and McCrory that apply to cabinet agencies, but there's also some fiscal note requirements with that. So I'm not really sure. Each agency has a different take on how that exemption works. But so it's a very fuzzy answer that I'm giving you, Paul, but um, I think we'd really have to talk through the specifics in order to reach that decision.
Great. And then we have a question from Christine. What if the agency is directed, I think, to engage in rulemaking by the state Supreme Court? Does that impact the manner in which the fiscal impact analysis we've done in any way?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure, yeah. If an agency is directed to engage in rulemaking by the North Carolina Supreme Court, would that impact the manner in which the fiscal analysis is done or the fiscal note is performed?
Ugh. I mean, I think I think that question might be having to do with baseline, I'm presuming. Um, it would really depend.
Sounds like that might be an
I think,
offline conversation.
yeah, sometimes it would depend.
Okay, all right. Is the petitioner of the permanent rule responsible for developing the fiscal note? And I'm not sure if that means if it's coming because of a petition for rulemaking, is it the petitioner's
Right.
obligation?
Right. Yeah. I'd have to refresh my memory on the statute that deals with petitions. Um, I think that there is some requirement for the petitioner to provide some fiscal information, but they themselves are not required they wouldn't submit a fiscal analysis to OSBM. That still needs to come from the agency, rather than the petitioner.
All right, thank you. And then, yes, 150B-21.3A D2 says if a rule is readopted without substantive change, or if a rule is amended to impose a less stringent burden on regulated persons, the agency is not required to prepare a fiscal note as provided by GS 150B-21.4.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the specific language, right, from the APA talking about readoptions. So
Good. Yep. Thank you
yes,
for that, Laura.
appreciate. Yeah.
Okay, good. And I think that's all the questions we had pending in our chat. So anything else, again, you're welcome to contact Julie or Jim or me directly. Glad to get you the information that's helpful to you. Thanks again for your time, and we hope to see you on our February 6th presentation. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.